right, well, this is Bonnie McFarland. Welcome to our part one of our two-part LCAP workshop series, and we're going to go ahead and get started because we have quite a bit to share today, and it's Friday afternoon, and we want to make sure we finish up as close to 4:30 as possible. So we will get started, and just as I mentioned, this is a two-part series. And we considered, and when we're designing how we'd provide support this year, we considered the CDE Tuesdays at 2 and Thursdays at 3 series, which is significantly more training than was provided in the past. And we also considered your time and know that you're running from Zoom to Zoom. So we wanted to make ours as clear and as succinct as possible. So we decided to provide two trainings. And our coordinators will follow up with districts individually and meet with you and work more individually throughout the rest of the year in supporting you. Also, we know that things may change as they have been all this year, and we may get new information, and we'll certainly continue to update you on those issues. Also, we will be listening to your questions, taking your questions, and if we see a need for an additional come back to discuss some additional questions, we'll also do that. So part one is really a basics overview of the process. And we'll be, as you can see, it's a very full agenda. We'll be looking at the template primarily, the changes in the template, and we'll also be looking at sort of the process and where we've been and where we are right now, and how this looks moving forward. The second workshop is going to focus more on some of the areas that have been most problematic, developing clearly defined actions and addressing the increased and improved services requirements. So we're going to drill down a little deeper in session 2. This one, session 1, is going to be perhaps for some of you, it's going to be, you're going to hear some things that sound familiar because we'll be reviewing the template, but there will be some new information too. So, and as you can see, we have a full agenda. So if you feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, you probably are not alone, especially if you're new. We're going to go through all the pieces and let you absorb it and answer any questions that you have. So as for questions, given we have a full agenda, and also, as usual, we send a follow-up Q&A, and we'll be doing that again this time. So put your questions in the chat, and we'll address them in a follow-up question and answer, so you have those in writing. And if there are any we need to follow up on and get more information, we will do that, so you have the most current and accurate information. All right, let's move ahead and get started. And we're going to be looking at the intent and purpose of LCFF and the LCAP. And we're also going to be looking at the impact of COVID closures on the LCAP. So let's move to the next slide. And this is sort of an overview of where we've been in 2021, which was totally as you know, a very different year, and then how that's going to impact moving forward in the coming year. So we're going to focus on the annual update, which you're going to be submitting in June, and a lot of the pieces of things you've been doing in the past, actually year and a half, will have an impact on that annual update that you're going to be doing. So we kind of want to take a look backward. So if you look at the center part, the red arrows, you'll see that the last LCAP you developed last June, and you submitted it in July 2019 for your 1920 LCAP. That was the last one you did. Then last January, the state board adopted a new template, and the new template was significantly different. And it also was the template that was supposed to be used for the new 3-year plan, which was supposed to be submitted in June. And of course, we all know that didn't happen. There was no June LCAP submission. Then in September, instead of the LCAP, Again, based on the governor's executive orders, which first postponed the LCAP, and then legislative changes, which then substituted it for the Learning Continuity Plan. September 30th, you had a Learning Continuity Plan due, which was very different from a typical LCAP and actually more focused on school closures and the impact of COVID. Each of those pieces, again, and then in December, you had a budget overview for parents, which was again out of sync. Usually that would be submitted with your LCAP. So the blue arrows kind of indicate those pieces that are going to show up in your annual update and that will need to be addressed. So first of all, the first arrow way back to that July 1920 submission of your 1920 LCAP, that will be reflected in your annual update. Also, your September submission of your Learning Continuity Plan will be a separate annual update that you'll be submitting. And then finally, the budget overview for parents should align with your annual update, and it will also be submitted in June. So the work you've been doing for really the past 2.5 years are all going to be reflected this year in the annual update. Also, if you notice, that 2020 new template is the template that will be used. The one that was approved last January for last year's LCAP is the one that will be used. And you might remember last year, right about this time, we were doing training on that template, but you never really used it. So we're going to be reviewing it today. So that's kind of where we've been and where we're going and how those pieces connect. And today our coordinators are with you, and Jeannie Keith, Adrian Balcasar, Evan Bartelheim, Rachel Garcia are all here, and they'll be walking you through those pieces and how they all fit together. All right, so on the next slide, we're going to just go back and just kind of a reminder about LCFF and the LCAP. And the LCAP, remember, it's based on local decision-making and accountability. And that local control is based on local input from stakeholders through the stakeholder engagement process. And for stakeholders to be a part of that, we go to the next box, which is transparency. And transparency requires that outcomes, actions, and reporting are all clear and comprehensible. It's all, the whole LCFF premise is based on that, and that transparency, and that stakeholders can understand, have input to, and hold districts accountable for actions and services. And then finally, LEAs receive additional funds for low-income students, English learners, and foster youth, and they're required to demonstrate in the LCAP how they're increasing or improving services for those students in proportion to those additional funds they receive. So that's the equity piece. So those are the three sort of pillars of LCFF and the LCAP. So a review on the next slide of the basis for the LCAP. The LCAP is actually grounded in the local control funding formula. You can't understand the LCAP without understanding the local control funding formula. In 2013, when the school funding model changed from a system of one unrestricted general fund and over 40 categoricals with separate rules, separate funding sources, it was based on an equity model of funding. So LCFF changed that and said, and indicated that we're going to provide additional funds for the two groups who were the focus of the previous categoricals, low-income students and English learners, and we're going to add in foster youth. And those are what we call the unduplicated pupil groups. And as a compromise for fiscal flexibility that LCFF offered by putting the funds into an unrestricted pot, they said LEAs were required to demonstrate how they'd increase or improve services for those students based on the additional funding they receive. So where do we find the requirements? And we'll see that on the next slide. And that is, there are three places you can look to find the requirements related to the LCAP. The first is in Education Code. Education Code describes the required components and the development and approval process. So that's where the basic foundational information can be found in the Education Code. Secondly, you'll find in the spending regulations were developed by the State Board of Education, and the spending regulations govern the increased or improved services requirement, and those are found in the California Code of Regulations. And then finally, Education Code indicates that approval has 3 criteria, and one of those criteria is adherence to the template. And CDE has reiterated that adherence to the template includes adherence to the instructions. So to find where the requirements are, you need to look in those 3 places to know where you find the basis for the LCAP. All right. So the LCAP has changed over time. And since 2014, was the first year we had the plan, it's sort of evolved. And a lot of that evolution has taken place because of complaints filed by the Uniform Complaint Process and upheld by the California Department of Education. So that's one way that the LCAP has been shaped. The second was a state audit report that came out in 2019, and it provided recommendations relative to the LCAP and has had significant impact on the LCAP. And then subsequent legislative changes have also taken place that have found their way into the LCAP. So what that's meant is that we've had changes to the template, we've had changes to the instructions for the template, and we've had components such as the budget overview for parents that have been added to the LCAP over time. So there's 2 types of requirements. On the next slide, you'll see the first type, and these are outlined in Education Code, and these are the basic content requirements. So what needs to be included in the LCAP? And first of all, we note that it's goals and outcomes for all pupils in each subgroup in each of the 8 state priority areas. So it should be addressing all 8 state priority areas for all students. There's a misperception that in some cases that the LCAP is only about the 3 targeted pupil groups, and that's not the case. It's really a district plan for all students in all 8 state priorities. The next that's required are budgeted expenditures for each action. So each action needs to be identified and the budgeted expenditures, including those that are serving your unduplicated pupil groups. And then the next requirement is for a review of progress and an assessment of effectiveness of the specific actions. And that you find primarily in the annual update. So that's how that requirement's met. And then the final requirement for content is the increased or improved services requirement, which requires a district to demonstrate how they're increasing or improving services for those 3 student groups in proportion to the increase in funds they received based on the number and concentration of those pupils. So the second are the process requirements. And the process requirements also defined in Education Code are consultation with specified stakeholder groups, and we'll take a look at who those groups are a little bit more later. A review of school plans to ensure alignment with LCAP actions and school plan for student achievement at school sites. Presentation of the LCAP to advisory groups, and all districts must have a parent advisory group, and districts that meet a certain number of English learners in their district need to also have an English learner parent advisory group. And that requires a written response by the superintendent to comments that are presented, provided to those groups. So a presentation of the LCAP prior to board approval, and then written response to those advisory committees. Next is the opportunity for public comment, and then finally adoption by the local governing board in conjunction with the budget adoption. So those are just a brief kind of overview of the process requirements. So we mentioned that there have been changes based on complaints through the Uniform Complaint Process, and some of them are listed here. And you can see that many of them are focused on the increased and improved services requirement, particularly around actions that are offered on a district-wide or school-wide basis. Some areas were about lack of clarity in the actions, rationales that are based on large numbers of student groups, which are called statements, and also concerns about how and if funds are actually used to benefit those particular student groups. So a number of areas of concern have been raised by the complaints. We'll take a look at some of the actual language in the next slide to kind of get a better picture of what those look like. So, oops, we went backward. So some of the sample have to do with, number one has to do with what you've seen in the LCAP in the last few years, is that requirement to address the needs, conditions of circumstances of one or more of those groups. And that came from complaints that indicated that districts were not indicating how they were identifying the needs of students and then how they were designing actions to meet those needs. The next is a typical one that came up was that the description throws in things like it's for English learners and foster youth as well as other groups, which made it impossible to definitely conclude that the action was principally directed. So you'll see the instructions focus on that principally directed. Conclusory statements sort of indicate that something is not described, it's just sort of taken for granted. So an action will increase or improve services just because we said so, but not showing how or how it will be effective. High enrollment, high numbers of students. That was another area in the complaints that just say, well, we have a lot of them. That's why we're providing this service. And they were saying that doesn't meet the standard of increased or improved services. And then we had a couple more that, again, on the next slide, again, looked at that high number. Again, this is an example from a complaint where it's 88%, but there was no description of how it's principally directed and effective those students. And then another area we mentioned, funds that are allocated for services at school sites, that it's not clear in some of those how that can be tracked, what those actions are. So why those are, they're not clear enough to really say what's happening and how can I, as a parent, know what's happening based on the LCAP and how can I follow that. So that's why we're going to spend our next sessions looking going in depth more at looking at actions. So some of the changes on the next page, you found there were additional descriptions added for what they call wide actions, district-wide, school-wide, charter-wide. So if those actions had additional language required that districts had to respond to describe those, the descriptions of how they were designed based on the needs, conditions, and circumstances of particular students. The addition of the budget overview for parents also came out of concerns addressed in the complaints, and the addition of the description of impact of stakeholder engagement came from stakeholders who were saying they didn't see themselves and their needs reflected in the LCAP. Another concern on the next page had to do with unexpended funds for unduplicated pupils. And some of the complaints raised concerns about underspending of funds on actions that were meeting the increased or improved services, that funds were budgeted, but then they weren't spent and they were moved over and swept in the next year into general activities that were not targeted to those students. And there were no findings in those complaints because there is nothing in the law that actually prohibited this. However, in 2019, the issue came up again in the state audit report. And that you'll see on the next slide is a picture of the audit report. And these are some of the recommendations in addition to the funding recommendation that came out of the report. And you see some of them have to do with the state's approach, some have to do more with districts, and again, clarity in describing how they principally benefit intended students. But on the next slide, you'll see how some of those turned into recommendations. And some of the main recommendations from the audit report were on this slide, just to require LEAs to annually reconcile estimated amount with actual amounts of supplemental and concentration funds, and specify that unspent supplemental and concentration funds at the end of the year must be spent on the following year for those pupils. So these requirements went forward, and they culminated in Assembly Bill 1835, which was proposed last summer. It was vetoed by the governor, and the reason for the veto is the governor said that in his he believed in what the concept, and he believed this needed to happen, but he didn't think this particular bill had enough detail in it, had the clarity in it to make sure this could actually happen. It just wasn't sure that they were able, based on the way the language was in the law, he wasn't comfortable with it, but he did indicate a commitment to follow through with the intent of the bill. Okay? And the next were some recommendations to the state board, and these were more related to changes in the template, changes in the instructions that might better support districts in improving the quality of their plans. Okay. We mentioned the funding issue, and the governor did follow through so far on his commitment to this. He said he's committed to equity, and in his budget budget summary, he made the proposal. He indicated that there would be statutory language to address this allocation of funds for increased or improved services, and the issue of having them unspent and reallocating them for other purposes. And he said the statutory language would require that once established, the LEA's responsibility to increase or improve services continues until it's filled. Essentially, this mirrors the 1835 intent that the funds would follow the students. That is, that's language from the governor's budget proposal. Nothing is in law or in proposed legislation right now. We anticipate to see that coming forward in budget language probably in June. So that would impact next year's program and next year's funding. Okay. So that's kind of where we've been from 2013 up to now, and one crazy year that you've been through, and how those pieces come together. But looking forward, on the next slide, you can see where we are now. We see this, the 3-year plan is an opportunity, and it really is. Nothing's the same as it was when you wrote your last LCAP, I'm sure. So now is a good time to be stopping and thinking and taking stock and seeing how can you revise your plan to really move forward and to operationalize equity in your district, and to work with your stakeholders to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie to move you forward now and look at the template and how to move forward on that. Jeannie?
Thanks, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. This is Jeannie, and I'm going to start off on the components in the template, and the rest of the team is going to join me to address each of the sections. So let's take a look at the next slide, where you can see the components that are included in the local control and accountability plan, and the related sections and requirements. These are listed on the slide in the order in which they are compiled in an LCAP. And so required to be included in the LCAP submission by July 1 is the budget overview for parents, the annual update this year for the 1920 LCAP and the Learning Continuity Plan, and the 21-22 LCAP template, including the required sections and the corresponding expenditure table. Collectively, these components make up an LCAP. Next slide, please. It's important to note that the instructions included at the end of the templates address what needs to be included in each of the sections. They are not suggestions. There are prompts on the outward-facing template that provide only an overview of each section. And this is for the public, and it does not include the detailed level of information that is required to be addressed in each component in the LCAP. During the review of the submitted LCAP, county offices must determine if the LCAP adheres to the template by reviewing the plan to determine if the response addresses what is required by the instructions for each section. Next slide, please. We'll take a look first at the budget overview for parents. So the budget overview for parents that was included in December was required to be submitted to address the learning continuity plan and the budget related to the 2019-20 LCAP. And the budget overview for parents that will be included with the July submission is currently in development. For each of these budget overview for parents, there are 3 sections that provide information for parents about the projected general fund revenue for the ensuing fiscal year, the total budgeted expenditures for the ensuing fiscal year, and expenditures for high needs students, who are also known as our unduplicated pupils, English learners, low income, and foster youth students. Let's take a look at the next slide, where we see a graphic, which is a visual of budget information and related plans that were addressed in this unique year, where we had the budget overview for parents in December. And you can see the budget years and plans that were addressed, and the budget year and plans that will be addressed with this year's LCAP submission in July. LEAs will be reporting their projected general fund total, their total budgeted expenditures in the LCAP for the 21-22 school year, and their estimated actuals for expenditures for budgeted expenditures included in their learning continuity plan. Moving on to the next slide. We're going to move into the annual update. And we're going to take a look at the annual update that's going to be included with this July's LCAP submission. It's important to note that CDE developed a special bridge template for the annual update that addresses both the 2019-20 LCAP and the current learning continuity plan. Because of the suspension of the LCAP in 1920, or for the 2021 school year, the annual update was never completed to address what occurred in the prior year, and there was never an analysis of the goals in the 1920 LCAP. In this one-time template, there is an annual update section that addresses the 2019-20 LCAP and a section that addresses the learning continuity plan and a section where both plans are analyzed together. This section provides a process for continuous improvement that requires LEAs to use available state and/or local data and feedback from stakeholders, including parents, teachers, and staff, to analyze what worked and to identify needs that will inform the development of their 21-22 LCAP. So moving on to the next slide, this visual provides an overview of the annual update that, as I stated, is really unique to this LCAP cycle in that it is addressing 2 different plans from 2 different times. Here you can see the 3-part format for this one-time annual update. In the pink section, you see it matches some elements and the format of the 1920 LCAP. The green area matches the sections in the Learning Continuity Plan. And the blue area addresses how the overall analysis of the two plans, when taken together, how this has informed the development of an LEA's LCAP for the upcoming year. If you feel overwhelmed today in learning the details in each part, come back to this grounding visual to remind yourself that this annual update is a process that reflects on two different plans to inform what the LEA plans to do in the upcoming LCAP to address their local needs. And now moving on to the detail. Next slide, please. We'll first talk about the 1920, the annual update that addresses the 1920 LCAP, or the pink section. For the 1920 LCAP, LEAs include information copied verbatim from their approved LCAP, and then they will provide actual outcomes and actual expenditures for the budgeted expenditures in each goal from their approved plan. You may notice that a section for providing an actual description for each planned action is not included in this annual update. Additionally, for each goal, the LEA completes a goal analysis. So let's look at each of the sections to understand a little bit more about the detail required. On the next slide, for annual measurable outcomes, we see the instructions provided for reporting the actual outcomes. Highlighted is specific information about data that is not available due to the impact of COVID. In these situations, the LEA needs to provide an explanation of why the actual outcome is not available, and if an alternative metric was used to measure progress, they need to specify what was used and what was the outcome. Next slide, please. This slide addresses actions and services, not annual measurable outcomes, as it is stated at the top there. I just am noticing that error. But in this slide about actions that were planned in the annual update, the LEA is reporting the actual expenditures. In the next section, on the next slide, we're going to move into the goal analysis, which has two components. This last section requires the LEA to provide a description for each goal of how funds budgeted for actions and services that were not implemented through the end of the year were used to support students, families, teachers, and staff. And here you can see on the slide, the instructions include additional details requiring the description to address how these funds supported students. And this description needs to include how it supported low-income, English learners, and/or foster youth students. Additionally, the instructions state that the description may include actions and services the LEA implemented to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 that were not part of the 2019-20 LCAP. Next slide, please. The second prompt for the goal analysis in the annual update requires the LEA to describe successes and challenges in implementing their actions and services to achieve each goal in the LCAP. LEAs are instructed to specify actions and services that were not implemented due to COVID, and to the extent practicable, and this means with data that speaks to the effectiveness, if it is available, LEAs should describe the effectiveness of each goal. Data for the description of effectiveness might come from state or local data. input from parents or other stakeholders. This analysis helps stakeholders to understand actions to consider continuing to implement or to not continue or to adjust in their LCAP moving forward. And this concludes the first section, which addresses the annual update for the 1920 LCAP. So take a breath. And make a mental note that now we are moving to the Learning Continuity Plan, which is addressed in this one-time annual update. Next slide, please. We're going to look at the sections and related instructions for the annual update green section addressing the current Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. The template includes some common elements that address sections in the Learning Continuity Plan. There are tables that include information about the actions included in the sections in the LEA's Continuity Plan. There is a section for description of substantive differences between the planned actions and budgeted expenditures in the sections of the annual update. And there is an analysis component where LEAs describe their successes and challenges in the sections of the continuity plan. Next slide, please. Here is the template and the instructions for the action table. For the tables included in each of the Learning Continuity Plan sections, the instructions require the LEA to identify the estimated actual expenditures for each section. You can fill in the blank with the statement on the slide with the plan sections. For example, you'll be providing the estimated actuals for each of the sections, such as distance learning, pupil learning loss, and additional actions. Also, for each section, the LEA must describe any substantive differences between planned actions and or budgeted expenditures in each of the sections in the continuity plan. And again, you can fill in the blank to represent the plan sections. Next slide, please. The analysis component is also a common element in the annual update section for the continuity plan. This is requiring LEAs to use available data and feedback from stakeholders to describe successes and challenges they have experienced in implementing each of the sections in the plan. We're going to take a look at the instructions for analysis in specific sections to see where and what additional information is required. Each of these sections is not the same for the analysis. Next slide, please. In distance learning, for example, the instructions for this section provide what is included in the prompt and additional requirements. From these instructions, which are included in the green box, you can see that the LEA must use available data and feedback from stakeholders, as we've seen before in the instructions, to describe successes and challenges implementing distance learning in each of the areas in the distance learning section in the plan. And additionally included is that their analysis about supports for pupils with unique needs must address supports for English learners, pupils with exceptional needs across the full continuum of placements, foster youth, and pupils experiencing homelessness. Additionally, from the instructions, we see that LEAs are encouraged to include an analysis of effectiveness of the distance learning program. Next, we'll move on to the pupil learning loss analysis. And in this section, the instructions also provide what is included in the prompt as well as additional requirements. You can see that the LEA must use the available data from stakeholders, as in the prior prompt, and they must also, in describing their successes and challenges in addressing pupil learning loss this year, to the extent practicable, include an analysis of the effectiveness of the efforts to address pupil learning loss, including for pupils who are English learners, low income, foster youth, pupils with exceptional needs, and pupils who are experiencing homelessness. Next section. There are two other analysis section components in the annual update here that are specific to sections in the plan. In the analysis for mental health and social emotional well-being, the instructions call out that the LEA must address the successes and challenges they had in monitoring and supporting both pupils and staff during the 21-22 school year. In the analysis for pupil and family engagement, the response must include a description related to the successes and challenges the LEA experienced in specifically implementing their tiered re-engagement strategies for pupils who were absent from distance learning, and include in their description the LEA's efforts to reach out to pupils and parents when pupils were not attending or engaging in instruction. And so take a moment to process that there are key components for each section related to the analysis in the annual update. And now we'll move to the overall analysis slide. I see we're already there. And so this is the final component of analysis in the Learning Continuity Plan section. The overall analysis provides the LEA a place to explain how they are connecting what they have learned from implementing the Learning Continuity Plan to inform the development of goals and actions in the LCAP for the upcoming school year. The overall analysis section has 3 parts. For each part, the key idea is that the LEA is explaining how what they have learned this year will move them forward, and specifically how that learning informs the development of their upcoming LCAP. The first part of this overall analysis addresses lessons learned overall from implementing in-person instruction and distance learning. The instructions here encourage LEAs to include in their explanation considerations about health and safety considerations, distance learning, monitoring and supporting mental health, and social emotional well-being, and engaging pupils and families, and how their response to COVID will inform their actions in their upcoming LCAP. The second part of the overall analysis, thanks for moving the slide, addresses how pupil learning loss continues to be assessed and addressed in the upcoming LCAP. And here the instructions require the LEA to explain specifically how this will occur specifically for low-income students, English learners, pupils with disabilities across the full continuum of placement, pupils in foster care, and pupils who are experiencing homelessness, as well as pupils with unique needs. You can see that the instructions specify here that the LEA include in their explanation how they are supporting mental health. And I'm sorry, that was from the prior section. I forgot to take that out of my notes. So here the key takeaway is with pupil learning loss, specifically addressing each of those student groups listed additionally in the instructions. And the third overall analysis requirement addresses the requirement to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils. And here the LEA needs to describe differences between substantive differences between the actions and services they included as contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement, and any actions or services that they implemented to meet this requirement. And it indicates that if the LEA has provided this description in one of the other sections in the plan, they don't need to additionally include it here. All right, so take a breath, because this is the conclusion of the Learning Continuity Plan section. And now I will conclude with the blue section for the annual update, where the LEA connects their learning from 2 plans to inform their LCAP for the upcoming year. While the size of this section is the smallest, it really is the key to the LEA's process for continuous improvement, and it reflects how they are using data and reporting and gathering and using input from stakeholders to design their 2021-22 LCAP. On the next slide, we can see a visual about this bridging overall analysis of the 2 plans. And the annual update overall analysis is the essential piece in bridging the 2 documents, or in bridging the learning from the past 18 months and addressing the implementation of 2 plans. So this overall is a key piece of the process that the LEA uses to reflect on their evaluation and their analysis to inform planning for the next year. In this section, LEAs describe how the analysis and reflection related to student outcomes in the 1920 LCAP and 21 continuity plan and input from stakeholders have informed the development of the upcoming LCAP. And now let's move to the next slide. And I'm sure you'll agree, we've addressed many requirements this afternoon. These are summarized in the Summary of Legal Requirements document, which we will be posting shortly. And keep in mind, the annual update section is the most new to the LCAP process, and it's unique in this year in that it addresses 2 plans. So don't feel overwhelmed, but take a moment to catch your breath. And remember, you can always go back to that grounding visual from the first part of this section. And I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter, who is Adrian.
Hi, everyone. Oh my gosh. You know, given that the time, and I know it's a Friday, and we really thank you for hanging in there with us. We're going to keep going. So as you know, we will be recording, we will be posting, and you'll be able to go back for anything that you perhaps missed. Okay, so we're going to move forward. As Bonnie had mentioned earlier about the instructions are really critical in that it is part of the template. So the intent of the prompts are to allow the reader, which are your stakeholders, your parents, and it is written in an understandable and accessible way for the reader. The instructions are just as important, and that is to provide the technical guidance for the districts that are writing the LCAP. And so they are much a part of the template. And they also need to be posted when you are posting your LCAP. And also the instructions have the full force of the law. So it's imperative that you have the instructions side by side as you're developing your LCAP, because that's part of the approval criteria. Because you have to adhere to the template, and the instructions are part of that. So again, we really want to stress how important that is, because just the prompts alone do not sufficiently, address all of the legal requirements. So looking at the 21-22 LCAP for this upcoming year, we need to keep in mind what happened. So this is the first year of the next 3-year LCAP. The only adjustments that were made to this template and instructions were to update the references to the current 3-year term. And so we know that the LCAP, if you had already started working and developing your LCAP before the pandemic, you can have that as a starting point, certainly, to see, but you want to make sure that it's still aligned to the current needs of your district and your stakeholder input, as well as your strategic plan. So you want to make sure that you don't just do a copy paste. You really need to take this opportunity to look again and pick up where you left off. However, a lot has happened, as Jeannie has mentioned and covered in your annual update. There's a lot to reflect on. And so perhaps there will be having, some deeper discussions about moving forward. And then also too, as a reminder, LEAs should also be completing the local indicator tools, which should also inform the development of your LCAP. So there's all these pieces that, we hope that we keep it all closely tight and tied up for you to move forward. So the next section that has to be completed is the plan summary. And for those of you that had seen this before, not much has changed in this. The purpose of the plan summary is just to provide a meaningful context for the 21-22 LCAP. And this section provides information about your community, as well as relevant information about your student needs and their performance. So in order to provide a meaningful context for the rest of the LCAP, this section should be completed so that it is clear and it's meaningfully related to the content that is going to come up in the upcoming sections of your 21-22 actions and services. So the first prompt in the plan is the general information. So here you will briefly describe the students and your community. This is an example here in this slide about what you can include in it in terms of geography, enrollment, employment, number, and size. The next section is the reflections, and there are 2 parts to this. You are reflecting on your successes and identified needs. And so for the 21-22 LCAP, both reflections, you're reflecting on the successes and the identification of needs, and they should be based on a review of the available state and local data, including the input from your stakeholders, which include teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, if you're a school district, local bargaining units, and parents and pupils. And remember that the data should demonstrate both what the successes were and what the identified needs were. When you reflect on the identified needs, you need to keep in mind what steps are you planning to take to address these areas of low performance and performance gaps. You know, you might need to look more closely at your locally collected data due to the pandemic and certain results or lack of results. So again, you want to make sure that you are taking into account all aspects of your local data, any self-reflection tools, and the input of your stakeholders. The next section is the LCAP highlights. And this is the last prompt in the plan summary, and it's an overview of the upcoming LCAP. And so here you're going to identify and briefly summarize some of the key features of your 21-22 LCAP. So this is kind of where you get to kind of shine and share with your public the great things that you are going to be putting forward in your 21-22 LCAP. Another section is the CSI prompts. And as you know, this is meant to address how the district supported the CSI schools with the development of the school's CSI plan. And so this school year, the districts and charters had to submit their CSI prompts separately to the County Office of Education. But for this upcoming year, the 21-22 LCAP, the CSI prompts will be submitted within the 21-22 LCAP. So it's going back to what it was previous pandemic. So you will be remembering to answer these three prompts. The first prompt is to identify the CSI schools that have been identified as a CSI school. You're also going to, in the second prompt, you're going to state and explain and describe how the district supported the CSI school with their needs assessment, with the data analysis, with the evidence-based practices, and a description of how the stakeholders were engaged in this process of developing the CSI plan. And the last prompt is important for the school and the district because the monitoring and the evaluating the implementation and effectiveness of the CSI plan must be done throughout the school year. So again, that all is part of the development of the school CSI plan and the district's response to how they supported the school's CSI plan. So that's what this section of the CSI prompts is about in the 21-22 LCAP. Now, we're going to look at stakeholder engagement section. And if you didn't walk away or you're sitting there and you're shaking your head about all of the different aspects of the annual update, the 1920 LCAP, the 2021 Learning Continuity Plan, and moving forward, if that doesn't, like jar you about meaningful stakeholder engagement, this really is so critical in the development of your LCAP. The key purpose of including everyone is to have a meaningful stakeholder engagement. It's not something that you show them at the end and, for your stakeholders to view at the end. And that's not the intent. The intent is to, in this section, is to explain your process and how you engage your stakeholders, to also address what perspectives and insights that came to light with these interactions, and how did you incorporate the perspectives and the engagement and what came out of this interaction in your strategic planning, so that it is reflected in this section. So there are three prompts to this section. The first prompt is a summary of the stakeholder process and how the stakeholder engagement was considered before finalizing the LCAP. So here you're going to describe the process. You're going to have to consult with all the statutory required groups, and you're going to make sure that you have included the process, the meetings, the engagement strategies that you took with the stakeholders. So all of this will be described in prompt 1. In prompt 2, you're being asked to give a summary of the feedback provided by the specific stakeholder groups. So here you're going to describe and summarize some of the feedback that was given, and also to indicate any kind of ideas or trends or insights that came from this analysis of the feedback of your stakeholders. Let's take a closer look at who those stakeholders are. So for the stakeholder groups that are required for districts and charters, we have the teachers, the principals, the administrators, other school personnel, parents, and pupils. If you are and for districts, it's SELPA and local bargaining units. But if you can take a look at the SELPA administrator, you will see that new this year for charters, if a charter is utilizing their LCAP as their SPSA, you also have the added requirement of including the SELPA administrator in that consulting. Also, the parent advisory committees is for district. This is the district advisory committee and the English learner parent advisory committee as well. But again, you can see the yellow asterisk, and you can see that these are required if charters are using the LCAP as their SPSA. And also to note in the blue that the superintendent needs to actually present the proposed expenditure and actions, and also give written comments back to any comments that were made from these meetings. So again, just a nice overview of what's required. Prompt 3, let's take a look at prompt 3. Prompt 3 is a description of the aspects of the LCAP that were influenced by the specific stakeholder input. So this is where you're going to be explaining in clear, specific information about how your LCAP was influenced, what portion of it, and as you can see this long list, it can include any of these aspects within this prompt, whether it's the inclusion of actions or a group of actions that was influenced by your stakeholder engagement, or was it elimination of actions, or were there any type of determination of effectiveness, determination of material differences, and as you can see, a lot can come out from the perspective and the insights of your stakeholder engagement activities and interaction. So in looking at the actual process, we can see that the green is showing how these are part of the development. The green is your legal requirement of consulting. It's looking at your advisory committees, and they are part of your development process. Also reviewing the school plans for districts and county offices. The school plan needs to be in alignment with the LCAP, so there needs to be that evidence or that process being followed. And for districts and county offices, that consultation with the SELPA. And as stated before in the previous slide, if the charters are utilizing the LCAP as their SPSA, they will need to include the SELPA. And something else, if you see in the green, we want to definitely make note of something new this year, and that is school districts and county offices of eds are required to provide members of the public with the opportunity to submit written comments regarding the actions and expenditures proposed in the LCAP. And we want to show you this visually so that you can see this is part of the green section, which is part of the development. So this is different than when you have a public hearing and you have it open for comments. This is specific to submitting written comments during the actual development stage of the LCAP. The next part you have is, once that's all done, you have a public hearing to gather the input, and then you go into the public meeting for the actual adoption, and then you have the actual adoption. So again, this is a nice visual of the whole process. So in looking at the summary of legal requirements, if you look at the public hearing, again, you have a legal obligation to notify members of the public of their opportunity to submit comments regarding the specific actions and expenditures that are being proposed in your LCAP, and you have to hold at least one public hearing. For the public meeting, you need to adopt the LCAP in a public meeting, and this meeting shall be held after but not on the same day as the public hearing. And also when you're adopting the LCAP, this meeting must be the same meeting as during your governing board of your adopting your budget. And so again, you can also have that your reporting of your dashboard local indicators included in this as well. So again, this is kind of your legal requirements, and this is included in the attachment that we will be providing you of the summary of legal requirements. And now I'm going to turn it over to Evan to talk about the goals and actions.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I will be providing just an overview of the components of the goals and actions section of the template. And please note that the screenshots in this section, as well as the ones probably that we just saw in Adrian's section, are taken from the CDE's LCAP template in Word. So if you're using an online system for your LCAP, such as LACO's eLCAP, document tracking services, or the CDE's eTemplate, the interface will likely look different, although you'll still be entering the same information. Next slide, please. So all LEAs must demonstrate in their LCAP how the LCFF funds are being used to meet the needs of all students. To that end, the LCAP must address the 8 state priorities and incorporate the specific metrics that the state has defined to monitor these priorities. The 8 state priority areas, just a reminder, are basic services. This includes sufficient instructional materials, school facilities maintained in good repair, and appropriately assigned and credentialed teachers, implementation of the state standards, parental involvement, pupil achievement, pupil engagement, school climate, a broad course of study, and pupil outcomes in the broad course of study. An LEA can't, of course, address each of the priorities with the same level of intensity, and the LCAP, while addressing all 8 areas, should actually prioritize goals, actions, and expenditures around their greatest identified needs. So LEA should consider performance on state and local indicators, local measures, as well as stakeholder feedback in establishing these priorities. Next slide, please. For each goal, LEAs must provide a description and an explanation of why the LEA developed the goal. As noted in the template instructions, well-developed goals will clearly communicate to stakeholders what the LEA plans to accomplish, plans to do in order to accomplish the goal, and how the LEA will know when it has accomplished the goal. The explanation for why the LEA has included this goal is an opportunity for LEAs to clearly communicate to stakeholders why, given all the areas of need, the LEA has decided to pursue this goal and the related metrics, expected outcomes, and actions and expenditures. Next slide, please. The approved template has identified 3 types of goals in the instructions. It's not required to specify what type of goal is being described, and actually the format of the goal is what determines the type. Also, there's no obligation to include all 3 types or any one specific type. To give you a quick overview, a focus goal is relatively more concentrated in scope and may focus on a fewer number of metrics to measure improvement. The focus goal statement will be time-bound and make clear how the goal is to be measured. And an example might include, for instance, a goal to target the needs of a specific student group that has been particularly harmed as a result of the pandemic. A broad goal is relatively less concentrated in its scope and may focus on improving performances across a wide range of metrics. These goals consider the needs of all students and will address issues that are of ongoing concern, but might not be an immediate priority. And finally, a maintenance of progress goal includes actions that may be ongoing without significant changes. These goals allow an LEA to track performance on any metrics not addressed in the other goals of the LCAP. And an example might be if an LEA's teachers are properly credentialed, the buildings are in good repair, and students all have textbook. This might be a good maintenance goal. It would just ensure that the priority 1 is being met and is being monitored, and that you're on top of it, but there's not a real immediate need to do something about it. Next slide, please. Each goal also includes a table for measuring and reporting results. This is our data table, and we are going to, just so you know, we'll be going into greater depth on data in our future meeting, but just a quick overview here. In this table, LEAs must identify the metrics that will be used to track progress toward the expected outcomes of the goal, include the metrics for all significant student groups, and identify expected outcomes that would reflect narrowing of any existing performance gaps. Include in the baseline column the most recent data associated with this metric available at the time of adoption of the LCAP for the first year of the 3-year plan, and include all required metrics as appropriate. So for example, a K-8 district is not expected to report out on graduation rate. Please note though that in the absence of some of the required state and local indicators from the California School Dashboard, LEAs are expected to identify additional state and local data to measure progress, at least temporarily for each goal. And I'll be discussing additional considerations on the next slide for completing this table. Also note the CDE has an upcoming deep dive on LCAP data, which you can find information about on their Tuesdays at 2 website, which is linked on this slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a little deeper dive into the measuring, reporting, results table. There are 3 columns in the measuring and reporting results table that must be completed during this LCAP cycle. And then there are 3 columns that will be filled out in subsequent years. So the first column, which is labeled metric, in this column, LEAs must identify the metric being used. So you should identify, explain the metric for your readers, identify the data source, specify the reporting period for any point in time metrics. These are metrics the LEA intends to report annually on the same date for comparability purposes. For example, daily attendance measured through April 15th of every year. Include all required metrics specified in Ed Code as appropriate. As I mentioned, if you're K-8, you don't need to report grad rate. Also include all relevant local measures in lieu of state measures that are temporarily unavailable. The next column, which is labeled baseline, in that LEA should identify the most recent data available for the specified metric. For some metrics, this may involve reviewing local data that the LEA is preparing for CalPads, for example. As noted in the metrics column, those metrics not available for 2020, such as CAS, BLA, and math, local measures should be identified as proxies for this baseline year. However, just a note, as we've discussed this, and I know you may have heard, or the question certainly arising, what should we do if we're missing some of these critical pieces? The dashboard wasn't published. LEAs are allowed. There's no provision saying you can't include 2019 data for required metrics as a placeholder. We know they're coming back eventually, right? So we're just thinking best practices. And in fact, if you have your 2019 data, it was never reported. Remember, the 2019 fall dashboard was never reported in LCAP. It might serve as a useful reference, so we know when that required metric does come back, you may be able to measure, demonstrate learning loss or have a better idea. So it isn't if it's not available as the most recent data, you are required to have a local metric. But just note, we think it might be good to include the existing metrics, even though they are slightly dated. Finally, there's the final column, desired outcome for 2023-24. And in that column, you're going to enter the outcome that the LEA would like to achieve in 3 years' time for the specific metrics. Notably, the 3 columns in the center, the year 1 to year 3 outcomes, those will be left blank this year. Next slide, please. And finally, for the goals and actions section, each LEA must complete the actions table for each goal. So actions describe what the LEA is doing to achieve the stated goal and to meet the expected outcomes. The action descriptions, we would like to see more than just a listing of planned expenditures. We always say who is doing what for whom. That's an action. Action description should clearly state who or what the action targets and how it will move the LEA toward its goal. And I like to think if the goal serves as the rudder to set the direction for the LEA, then the actions are like the oars, right? The actions are what are going to move us toward that goal. Next slide, please. So a little bit deeper dive here into the table. Each entry in the actions table requires the following. So you need to identify the action number. You need to identify a short title that will also appear in the expenditures table. You need to provide a description of the action, and then you need to provide the total amount of expenditures associated with this action. And I'll just note here, there's a little bit of a disconnect here. Like if you're not using an online system, you're going to have to match up the titles you include in the actions table with the titles in the expenditure table, which I'll talk about briefly. If you're using an online system like LACO's eLCAP, these will be coordinated. So you'll put it in one place and it'll appear throughout. But I just make a note here that you have to be on top of keeping track of what you entered in each place, including the amounts, because it doesn't auto-populate between the two metrics if you're using the CDE's template here. Finally, just note two other pieces. LEAs that have a numerically significant EL student group, so 30 or more, are required to include specific actions related to, at a minimum, the language acquisitions programs for those students and the professional development activities specific to English learners. And also LEAs with a numerically significant number of foster youth, which is 15 or more, are strongly encouraged to include specific actions designed to meet those students' needs. Next slide, please. I love this section because it's a throwaway. So this is the goal analysis, which will be the annual update, but you don't have to fill it up for next year. So it should be left blank for this year. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to briefly discuss the increased or improved services section. Please note that we will be going into much greater depth about this section in the next meeting. It's one of the most challenging sections to fill out. But from the LCAP template instructions, just note, a well-written increased or improved services section provides your stakeholders with comprehensive description within just a dedicated section of how an LEA plans to increase or improve services for its unduplicated pupils as compared to all other students, and how the LEA-wide or school-wide actions they're undertaking for this purpose meet the regulatory requirements. These descriptions should provide sufficient detail, yet be sufficiently succinct to promote a broader understanding for stakeholders to facilitate their ability to provide input to the LCAP process. And an LEA's description of this section must align with the actions included in the goals and actions section that are marked as contributing. Next slide, please. So there are two boxes at the top of the increased or improved services section that must be filled out. The first box, the percentage to increase or improve services, reflects the required proportional increase or improvement in services for unduplicated pupils relative to all students, which is calculated using the additional funds apportioned to an LEA for the number and concentration of unduplicated pupils. A common misunderstanding is that this is the percentage of your unduplicated pupils. It's not. It's a financial calculation. The second box, the increased apportionment amount, is an estimate of the funds that will be apportioned to the LEA based on the number of unduplicated pupils for the LCAP year for which you're writing. Both of these boxes should be, the fiscal staff should be able to fill these out using the LEA's preferred LCFF calculator. Next slide, please. The next field in the increased improved services section is the first prompt in the required descriptions, which asks LEAs to provide an explanation of any actions that are being provided to an entire school or across the entire school district. We refer to these as wide actions, so LEA-wide, district-wide, school-wide, charter-wide, and these are actions that are not provided exclusively to unduplicated pupils, so these require an explanation. By contrast, limited actions, which are provided only to an unduplicated pupil group, do not require justification. To demonstrate how an LEA or how an action is principally directed towards an effective in meeting goals for unduplicated students, the LEA must explain the following in establishing the action: how it considered the needs, conditions, or circumstances of the targeted unduplicated pupil group, how the action or aspects of the action, including, for example, its design, content, methods, or location, is based on these considerations, and how the action is intended to help achieve an expected measurable outcome of the associated goal. We'll go into a lot greater detail on this in our future training, and we hope to provide some nice frames to help you kind of ask that question. Is this a contributing action? Do I meet all the criteria for needs, conditions, and circumstances? Next slide, please. So just a couple notes. There are two explanations that we have commonly seen in this section that aren't sufficient. These include conclusory statements and a justification based on a high enrollment of UDP. So conclusory statements are statements that a service will help achieve an expected outcome for the goal without an explicit connection or further explanation as to how. An example, we would see something like, this action will be principally directed towards and effective in meeting the needs of our English learners. but it doesn't explain what needs, conditions, and circumstances went into that. Also, just stating that an LEA has a high enrollment percentage of specific student groups does not meet the increased or improved services standard, because enrolling students is not the same as serving students. And we do see this one also in terms of because of our high percentage enrollment of unduplicated students, these actions are invariably principally directed towards and effective in meeting goals for unduplicated students. It's tempting to jump to that conclusion, but it doesn't meet the criteria that's established in the legislation. Next slide, please. So 2 final notes on this first prompt. Any actions that an LEA is choosing to continue into the 21-24 LCAP from their 2017-2020 LCAP must be reflected on. So the LEA must determine whether or not that action was effective as was expected. And this determination must reflect evidence of outcome data or actual implementation to date. So you need to, you can't just roll them over unquestioned. You have to take a look back and say, was this working? And where were we in the implementation process? And what more do we need to do? And that needs to be reflected in this section. Also, there are some additional requirements. These are specific to school districts. So if a school district has less than 55% unduplicated pupils, or a school for a school-wide action has less than 40%, then the explanation must include a consideration of how the use of funds is most effective. So we'll go into that also in more detail as to what determines most effective in our next presentation. Next slide, please. So the second prompt in the increased or improved services required explanations requires a description of how the LEA is increasing or improving services by required percentage through actions addressing identified needs of the students who are low-income English learners or foster youth. So this description should incorporate all of the actions in the plan that are identified as contributing to increased or improved services, so both your wide actions and your limited actions. And it should explain how these actions are first over and above what is being done for all students, how they are improving services for the targeted group or groups in quality, or how they're increasing services for the targeted groups in quantity. And please note that actions described here must include at least some LCFF funding. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly go over the expenditure tables. It's been a year. These were brand new. We hadn't really even got started. So it's tempting to say that these are brand new, but they may look familiar. The expenditure tables were added to the LCAP template to provide readers with an overview of all expenditures in a dedicated section. And on this slide, you see a screenshot of the data entry table from the CDE's template. And like I noted before, if you're using an online tool to complete your LCAP, such as the LACO eLCAP system, these tables will be populated within those systems, and the appearance may be substantially different. And I will give you an example just before I end of what LACO's eLCAP will look like. Next slide, please. So the data entry table, which we actually, because it's so hard to kind of capture it with the spreadsheet that the template provides, we put it all into one slide so you can see what's required here. The data entry table is where LEAs will enter the data that we'll use to populate the other tables. So the total expenditures, the contributing expenditures, as well as the annual update expenditure tables. It's not necessary to include the data entry table with your approved LCAP, but you can share it at your discretion if you decide to put it in there. And on this slide, we provided just an overview of the required fields. LEAs will need to provide the identifying goal and action number, a short title describing the action, and the student groups being targeted. Whether an action is considered contributing to increased or improved services, this must be specified. And if an action is contributing, identified as contributing, some additional details, including the scope of the action, the specified unduplicated groups that are being served by the action, and the location of the action is required. The total personnel expenditures must be entered for each action, followed by the amount of LCFF funds, other state funds, local funds, and or federal funds being used for that action. And then the table will automatically calculate the total funds budgeted, as well as the non-personnel expenses. They're going to basically take your total funds and subtract your personnel expenses to come up with the non-personnel funds, as well as the percentage represented by the personnel expense, another auto-calculated feature. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've included screenshots from the total expenditures and the contributing expenditures table from the CDE's template. As I noted on the last slide, both of these tables are automatically populated by the data entry table. The total expenditures table includes the action title, the student groups targeted by the action, and the amount being spent from each funding source on the action. And the contributing actions table will include only those actions identified as contributing, the scope of the action, whether it's limited, school-wide, LEA-wide, the unduplicated pupil group or groups for whom the action is intended, the location where the action is being implemented, the LCFF funds being used, and a total of all funds being used. So you could have an action that included both LCFF and other local funds, for example. The table also includes a calculation of the total LCFF funds budgeted for contributing actions and the total of all funds budgeted for these actions. Next slide, please. So this slide, another fun one because you don't have to fill it out. This includes a screenshot of the annual update tables. These expenditure tables will be populated in subsequent years. They don't need to be populated this year. The annual update, as Jeannie discussed earlier, it's a transition year, so you'll be adding your estimated actuals for the learning continuity plan and your actual expenditures from the 1920 LCAP in a different document for this year. Next slide, please. Finally, one consideration for charter schools using the LCAP as their SIPSA. The CDE expenditure tables don't include an option to break down federal funds by program, so by title. However, there is not a rule barring an LEA from adding more data tables to the LCAP. So you might consider doing something like you see on this slide, which is a modified total expenditures table that you can add as an appendix. So you can essentially track all your title expenditures for the purposes of your SIPSA. The eLCAP system does provide an option to specify federal funding sources. So that's possibly a reason you may want to look at using the eLCAP system. Next slide, please. So just as an example of what that might look like, we've kind of set our eLCAP up slightly differently. This is an action. So each action, as you enter it, we actually include a little bit more here. Would include the action title, a brief description, and all of the actions. This is serves like a data entry table, but we've also added the title boxes, entry fields for the title of programs at the bottom. So that could be used to generate, will be used to generate a separate table that you could use if you're using your LCAP as your SIPSA. And that is it for me. I'm going to hand it off to Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for hanging in there. We are almost done here, just a little bit more to go. And so next, we're going to be taking a look at the LCAP development timeline and some resources to support you with this process. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights some of the key components in the LCAP development process that will need to occur from now until July 1st, which is the deadline to adopt the LCAP. This includes consulting with all of the required stakeholder groups throughout the process, presenting the draft LCAP to the Parent Advisory Committee and English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, providing the opportunity for the public to submit written comments, providing a public hearing, and presenting the local indicators to the board. And as a reminder, the LCAP must be submitted to the County Office of Education not later than 5 days after the adoption of the LCAP. And then that's when the official county office review process begins for school districts. Next slide, please. So as we know, there are many more components to the development process than what was discussed on the previous slide. And so to support your backwards planning of the LCAP development process, we put together a 2020-21 timeline for the development process. And here you can see screenshots of this document. So this document is specific to school districts, but we're also working on a version for charter schools. The document starts with the development, implementation, and monitoring of the learning continuity plan that occurred in the fall, and then moves into the development of the annual update of the 2019-20 LCAP and the 2020-21 learning continuity plan. And the final page focuses on the 2021-22 LCAP plan development process. In this document, you'll see that key components for stakeholder engagement are embedded throughout, as well as considerations for keeping your board updated throughout the process. Also noted in this timeline document is the pre-review process that is available for school districts to receive feedback on the annual update and the LCAP. The pre-review process is optional but strongly recommended. If your LEA will be submitting a draft for pre-review, then it will be important to incorporate this into your backwards planning timeline. Next slide, please. As you're backwards mapping your LCAP development process, one of the things that will also need to be considered is the local indicators timeline. This year, LEAs will need to present 2020-21 local indicators outcome data to the governing board at the same board meeting in which the LCAP is adopted. If you have not yet established a plan on what evidence will be collected this year for local indicators, you'll want to do that as soon as possible so that you can begin collecting and evaluating the data collected. Local indicator data should also inform the development of the LCAP. So it will be important for LEAs to connect the local indicator process with the LEA planning process. And just as a reminder, the local indicator outcome data that's presented to the governing board in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP will also need to be submitted in November 2021 for the fall 2021 dashboard. Next slide, please. So here we see the local indicators that LEAs must measure progress and report on annually based on locally collected data. And so this includes basic services and conditions for priority 1, implementation of state academic standards for priority 2, parent and family engagement for priority 3, school climate priority 6, and access to a broad course of study for priority 7. The last 2 local indicators listed only apply to county offices of education. Next slide, please. To support your work with the local indicator process, we wanted to highlight some available resources. So first off, the CDE is hosting a Thursday at 3 webinar next week to provide more information on the dashboard local indicator process. The CDE also has a local indicators webpage, and the link has been provided on the slide. And this webpage provides information and resources on the local indicators, including the state board approved self-reflection tools that LEAs use to report progress on local indicators to stakeholders and the public. And so here you can see a screenshot from the local performance indicator quick guide, which provides a brief overview of the self-reflection tools that are available to LEAs. And so this quick guide can also be accessed on the CDE local indicators webpage at the link provided. Next slide, please. So here are just a few ELCAP updates. So first off, as a reminder, all LEAs and charter schools will submit the LCAP through the ELCAP system. So if you're using document tracking services or the CDE template, you'll upload a PDF to the ELCAP system. The annual update template is not yet available in the ELCAP system, but it should be available in about 2 weeks, and we will be sure to notify everyone through our LCAP contact list once it does become available. The 21-22 LCAP template, however, is available and is ready for use in the ELCAP system. And just a few other things that we're working on an ELCAP training video, as well as an ELCAP submission guide. And so again, we'll notify everyone once those items become available. Next slide, please. So in this next section, just some brief information on the approval process for the LCAP. Next slide. So statute provides the requirements and timeline for LCAP approval. So as previously mentioned, the LCAP must be adopted by the local governing board by July 1st, and then submitted to the County Office of Education within 5 days of adoption. The review and approval process begins following the submission of the local board approved LCAP. On or before August 15th, the County Office of Education can request clarification in writing. The district must then respond in writing to the request for clarification within 15 days. Within 15 days of receiving the response from the district, the County Office of Education may provide recommendations in writing for amendments to the LCAP. The district must then consider the recommendations in a public meeting within 15 days of receiving the recommendations. The deadline for the county office to approve the LCAP is October 8th. And it's also important to note that the district's budget cannot be approved until the LCAP is approved. Next slide, please. When reviewing the LCAP, there are 3 criteria for approval. First is if the LEA has adhered to the template and has followed the instructions for completing the template. Second, the LEA budget for the fiscal year includes expenditures that are sufficient to implement the actions in the LCAP. And finally, that the LEA has demonstrated how it is meeting its requirement to increase or improve services for students who are low income, English learners, or foster youth. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of information on the posting requirement for the LCAP. So once the LCAP is approved, all LEAs and charter schools must post it on their website. And it must be posted as one document in the following order. So first, the budget overview for parents, then the 2019-20 and 2020-21 annual update with the instructions, then the narrative of the LCAP, which includes the plan summary, the stakeholder engagement, goals and actions, increased or improved services, the expenditure tables, and then finally the LCAP template instructions. Next slide. And so this slide just shows a screenshot of the order of the LCAP components that must be posted on the website. And so just as a reminder, all components of the LCAP must also be posted for the public hearing and board approval. And it's also important to note that the final version approved must be posted on the LEA website. So if there's any changes along the way, whatever that final version is that is approved by the county must be posted. Next slide, please. So just regarding our resources, the PowerPoint from today's meeting, as well as a recording of today's meeting, and all of the resources that we've shared, including the LCAP and annual update templates with the embedded instructions, the summary of legal requirements, and the LCAP development timeline, all of those items will be posted on our LACO LCAP webpage at the link provided on the slide. Next slide, please. And just a reminder of some upcoming workshops. Our next LCAP workshop is scheduled for February 23rd, and the registration link is included in the slide if you've not had a chance to register. And we've also included a registration link to an EL Rise, English Learner Aligned LCAP Toolkit Workshop. And this is a 2-day workshop that is coming up next month. And on the next slide, we have included the dates and topics for the upcoming CDE Tuesday at 2 and Thursday at 3 webinars. Next slide, please. And so as always, we will be responding to all of the questions in the chat with our Q&A follow-up document. And this will be emailed to participants as well as posted on our LACO LCAP webpage. So if there's any additional questions, please be sure to leave them in the chat. And on the next slide, we have our contact information. So if there are any additional questions, you can reach out to any one of us. And again, thank you all for joining us. And we will leave the chat open for a few more minutes in case there are any additional questions.